Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, February 12th, 2025, and our friend Colonel Jacques Baud is back with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you very much for inviting me again.
Let's get started, Colonel, with Donald Trump's plan for Gaza. And he's trying to force the king of Jordan to accept, together with Egypt, to accept 2.3 million Palestinians. And he's talking about the United States wants to take over Gaza. How can we understand that? It seems to me that it's totally disconnected with the reality. How do you find it?
Well, there are a lot of question marks with this proposal because, first of all, we don't know exactly what he's aiming at because sometimes he said he wanted uh, to make Gaza better. We don't know exactly for whom. Is that for the Palestinians or for real estate agent or Israelis? We don't really know. He wanted to buy the area. He wanted to rebuild the area. He wanted to send Palestinians temporarily in Egypt or Jordan. And sometimes it's the word temporarily seemed to disappear. So it's not very clear what he wants. Apparently, what I've heard, and no, I'm not able to assess that very precisely, but apparently he was reading a document when he made this declaration. He was reading a document that was written by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Now, meaning that he's probably not very familiar with the nitty-gritty of the issue. He was probably it's just in his mind. The problem is with Trump, and you have exactly the same thing with Ukraine, by the way, that I think, I mean, to his credit, we can say he wants to solve situations. And that's already something. He wants to do something, which is fine. The problem is that when you do something, you need to have a very clear and exact, a precise picture of the situation. What is at stake, really? And my understanding is that for both Ukraine and Gaza, uh, Trump doesn't have, he has a rough picture of the situation, but not a precise picture of what is at stake for Israel, what is at stake for the Palestinians, same as you have in Ukraine, by the way, because it started to come with a plan or something that you can call a plan, maybe. The word plan could be put in quotation marks, but anyway, at least an idea if you want. But we see that this idea is not one-to-one implementable because many factors have been just discarded. It's a simplified picture of the situation. It has somehow a cartoonish understanding of the situation. So a lot of details have disappeared. So the problem with Gaza, with the Palestinian, is not that they don't have a house. I mean, obviously it's a problem for the Palestinians, but that's not the essence. The problem is that they don't have a territory. And it's not that they don't have a territory. It's that they don't have their territory. In addition to that, we could even say that their territory is not even what is in Gaza, but what is outside Gaza. Because most of the inhabitants of Gaza originate from those refugees of 1948 from the Nakba. And these people used to live in the southern part of Israel. They were repelled in this area, which is today called Gaza. But this area didn't exist before. You know, it's a huge refugee camp that was created by the Israelis, essentially. So here is the problem. You know, of course, they would like to have a better life, that's for sure, and they would certainly welcome to have nice buildings and a nice flat screen TVs and all that, no doubt. But this is not the essence. The essence is that they were expelled from their own homes and villages 80 years ago, and now they took refuge in this area, and now they are expelled again from this area. And what adds to the problem is that Israel continues on the same path since 80 years without being sanctioned by the international community, although it was stated on many documents, resolution. There are almost 100 resolutions of the United Nations that condemn the action of Israel. And these resolutions do not condemn Israel because they are Jews. They condemn Israel because Israel is not behaving according to the rule, the international law, and took over territories illegally. As I said, the starting point of all that is, of course, Resolution 181 of 29th of November 1947. And if you read this document, you would say that, in fact, Israel could build, you could have those two countries, an Arab state and a Jewish state, but based on referendum, based on consultation of population. And to avoid that, Israel just took over the territory. And it took over not after 1948, but before 1948, between November 1947 to May 1948. And even if you read the memories, the memoir of David Ben Gurion, he said that in May 1948, they had even taken more territory than the territory that was proposed in this possible partition plan that was annexed to the resolution of 47. So that means that there is not a single square meter of Israel that has been acquired legally by Israel. Everything has been taken by force. So if you are Palestinian today, you see that you are expelled by brutal force from place to place. And in addition to that, the guy who expels you, in fact, is not sanctioned in any way. So how can you see the situation without having some anger? And that's probably what Donald Trump misses in assessing the situation. Now, as to the plan itself, again, it doesn't solve the problem. It just kicks the can down the road, because again, the problem is not for the Palestinians to have a place. In fact, there have been several proposals that have been made in the past, even by Saudi Arabia, if I'm not wrong, to have these the refugees, or at least some of them, on their territory. So the problem is not the space. The problem is that you are on the territory, the place where you were born, and you are expelled from that place. And this is a question of justice. This is a question of humanity, and this is a question of international law. And just pushing the Palestinians outside of Palestine, in fact, is simply not the solution of the problem. And I think this is very strange, because it's strange in a sense. On the other hand, it's not very surprising because US has consistently followed blindly what Israel was saying, and for that reason, this is not real a surprise to see that. But it is strange to acknowledge or observe that the Americans have not yet understood the very nature of the problem. Because regardless of how you feel about Israelis or Palestinians, such a solution as the one that was proposed by Trump cannot bring the solution. Cannot, simply cannot. And and all the nations, I mean the nations that are and countries that are around Israel have understood that perfectly. And that's the reason why even last year, Anthony Blinken tried to ask the same question, both to the Egyptian and the Jordanian governments, to take these Palestinians. And Egyptians refused. I mean, Egyptians and Jordanians refused. Interestingly enough, this was taken by Western propaganda as the fact that you see, even the Arabs don't want Palestinians. The Arabs don't even want to help their brothers. But it's not the question. And here, the reason why Egypt doesn't want to have the Palestinian on the territory is that there are many reasons. The first one is that by doing so, Egypt would in fact accept or tacitly accept this factual problem that Israel is trying to gain territory by expelling Palestinians. So that's the first, because everybody knows, because it has been the case in the past, that if the Palestinians are moved in Palestine or Jordan, they will not come back. They will not be back. Everybody knows that. And the Israelis have consistently applied this policy of no return. Even though that I remind you that in order to be member of the United Nations in 1949, the Israelis or the Israeli government pledged to abide by the international law and UN resolutions, including the right of return for the Palestinians. And that was a condition for Israel to enter or to get membership for the United Nations. And since then, Israel never complied with its own word. So how would they change today? This is so. That's the first reason why both Egyptians and Jordanian don't want to have the Palestinians, because that would be what you call in French a fait accompli. That's a situation that then you have to accept, and that will not change. That's the first reason. The second reason is that, as it happened in the 60s and 70s, I mean, late 60s and early 70s in Lebanon, if you have Palestinians in refugee camps in Egypt or Jordan, they will carry on military operation or raids or commando operations against Israel. And that will not solve the problem again. That's exactly what happened with Lebanon. And that's the reason why you had all these Israeli intervention in South Lebanon. By the way, this situation, the Palestinians being right on the border of Israel and conducting military operation, cross-border operations, that led Lebanon in a crisis situation, because Lebanon itself was dragged into a conflict that was not his conflict. And that's the whole consequence of that, is the creation of Hezbollah and all that. But basically, the Palestinian conflict is not the conflict. It's not a Lebanese conflict, but Lebanon was dragged into that because it had all these refugees. Meaning that if you have a similar situation with Jordan and Egypt, that would lead probably to the same consequences. And that's exactly what both the Egyptians and the Jordanian don't want. So that's the second. The idea that some floated that since Hamas is a Muslim brotherhood and therefore that would create unrest in Egypt because they already had problem with this is bullshit. This is plain lie. The reason is, and that's something I'm just opening a parenthesis here. This narrative that Hamas is a faction of an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood is wrong. Hamas splitted from the Muslim Brotherhood because they didn't agree with the Muslim Brotherhood. They have fundamental ideological and I would say doctrinal differences with the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's why they split from the Muslim Brotherhood. And if you look in the region, by the way, Muslim Brotherhood is an organization that you find in the Mashrek area, not in the Maghreb area. That's also important to say, because as you say, it started in Egypt. And you have Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, you had Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, and you have Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey. And in all these places, the name of the organization remains Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. I mean, no, they were expelled by Hafez al-Assad, but anyway. So Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey, and so on. But Hamas is not Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. It's not. It's a Hamas. It's something different, because precisely even if Sheikh Yassin, who is the one who created the Hamas, used to be member of the Muslim Brotherhood, he split from that. The same as Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat was also a member of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, but he split from that, and nobody talks about it now. But initially, that was that, because the Muslim Brotherhood in the 20s up to the 40s, that was the big liberation movement of the area. Anyway, so Hamas has nothing to do with the Muslim Brotherhood, and this is not. I think the Egyptians do not have any concern about this. They have a concern because they would have a fighting force, a potential fighting force on their territory that would drag them into possible conflict with Israel, and they don't want that. So that's a second reason. And so these are the essential reason for this. And finally, no, there is also something important that would be contrary to the international law, because you cannot have create permanent refugee camps in some places, and Israel using its neighbors to create permanent refugee camps. So that would be against the international law. The next question would be, who would fund that? So there's absolutely no reason whatsoever for the Egyptians and the Jordanian to accept that. And you probably have an additional factor that came to the surface, especially in the last 1 year and a half of the operation in Gaza. It's that it has become absolutely apparent for the whole world that Israel is not abiding by the international law. You know, prior to that, you had Israel bombing Gaza from time to time, but they're saying, "Oh, they are terrorists, so we can bomb them," and everybody was happy, even in the West. Nobody questioned that. Today, the problem is slightly different because it has gained such a dimension that it's no longer possible to ignore the violation, the blatant violation of the international law. In addition to that, Netanyahu has been indicted by the international, the ICC
ICC,
court,
International Criminal Court.
and of course you have these proceedings going into the International Court of Justice, meaning that we know today, and it's obvious for everybody, regardless of who you are. I mean, obviously, you have people that don't have bad faith who would not understand that. But let's say for the majority of the population of the world, it's clear that Israel is not respecting the law, the international humanitarian law. So why would you accept to cooperate with such a state? You know, this is an additional problem. And I didn't even mention the fact that there are probably a lot of Egyptian, I don't know about the government, but probably many Egyptian, I mean the population, who share the compassion for the Palestinians. And they have some kind of solidarity with the Palestinians. And that's certainly the case in Jordan, by the way. And having even Palestinians in those countries, especially in Jordan, because that was the case in the late 1960s, and that's why you had the famous Black September, September 1970, in which the Jordanian government expelled all the Palestinians from the country because they were, in fact, by their presence, by the fact that they were continuing fighting or conducting cross-border operations, they were destabilizing Jordan. So, and the Jordanian, I remember when I was in Jordan just a few years ago, I was during my time in NATO, we had some exercise to be prepared with the Jordanian army, and so I had a contact with my peers in the Jordanian army, and when we talked privately, I mean not in official meetings, but when we were outside, and when I asked about the situation and how they felt about the situation, I mean, these guys has absolutely no good feelings about Israel, and they have a lot of solidarity with the Palestinians. So, meaning that having the Palestinians today conducting operations, let's say the same as what you had on the 7th of October, the operation, the flood, Al-Aqsa flood. Let's imagine we could have such an operation that would have the potential to destabilize completely Jordan. A very huge. I mean, we have also to remember that Jordan used to be part of Palestine. You know, Jordan used to be part of Palestine. It's in the early 1920s, that Palestine was divided, and the British, the mandatory power, because after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the British had the authority to manage Palestine, and they decided unilaterally to give what is today called Jordan, which used to be Transjordan. They gave them to the Hashemite tribe, whose king is today the king of Jordan. And by the way, it's also interesting to understand that, because Benjamin Netanyahu comes from a faction of the Likud party, which is a right-wing nationalist faction of the Likud, I mean, extremely a nationalist. And it comes from this faction, which used to be called the revisionist Zionists, or Zionist revisionists. And the word revisionist refers to this idea that was born in the 30s. And this faction used to be then led by Mr. Jabotinsky, who, by the way, had a training camp with fascist Italy in Civitavecchia. That's another topic. But Jabotinsky and the faction of Jabotinsky, those revisionist Zionists, were in favor of a revision of the decision of the British to give Jordan to the Hashemite, because they thought that Palestine was, in essence, what you see today when you see Israel and the occupied territories. That's one part. But the other part would be Jordan. And that's what, and if you look at these, again, I think I have shown you that. I don't know if I have the picture here again, but when you see the logo of these Zionists, they see Palestine, I mean Israel, including Jordan. Meaning that for the Jordan, it's almost having this kind of threat that if anything happened in Jordan, the Israeli would, without any doubt, attack Jordan and start to annex Jordan to Israel. Because for them, especially Netanyahu and his followers and the right-wing members of the government, they think that Jordan, which used to be Transjordan, belonged to Palestine, period, and therefore to Israel. So you see that the implications of having the Palestinians on the territory of Jordan has a potential of creating a lot of instability in the region. And that's the reason why both Jordanians and the Egyptians don't want to have that. Now, is this idea doable? I don't think so. The outrage that appeared in the media around the world after what Trump said, I think, is a signal for the US that it's probably not the right way to go. You know, we have to remember, I'm ready to give some credit to Donald Trump because at least he's trying to do something, which is something positive compared to what we have seen before. But at the same time, Trump is not very much appreciated in the world. Not even because with the tariff policy that he's applying, and everybody starts to hate Trump now. But also beyond that, I mean, Trump was not very much, nobody liked him as he came in his first presidential term. And today it's probably a little bit better because obviously in the United States, the American population wanted a change and wanted someone who could improve a situation that was clearly deteriorated during the Biden mandate. So they wanted to have an improvement, and based on that, we can say that at least in the US, the legitimacy of Donald Trump is definitely improved, and probably around the world also. But at the same time, Trump is still Trump. You know, he makes a declaration, and I'm not sure that what he says is always well thought. He's kind of a hip shooter, you know, and that makes him kind of a that let's say he doesn't have a huge of credibility because of that. And for that reason, when it comes up with project or ideas such as the one he proposed for Gaza, I think it's not credible for most people. And I think he understands that. And for me, this plan is probably something that will remain in the air because obviously Netanyahu has understood that this is an option that would fit perfectly in his views. So we can admit that Netanyahu will continue with this idea, but I'm not sure the Americans will. Again, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think this is leading nowhere. And Trump is starting to understand also. I made the comparison with the Ukrainian issue, and I think on both theaters, Trump and his team starts to understand that situations are a little bit more complex than one they figured out before, and therefore they need to deepen a little bit make a little bit more homework to come up with practicable solutions to solve the problem. And we need to see. You remember, for Ukraine, he wanted to stop the conflict within 24 hours, and then it was like 100 days, and now we everything understood. Everybody understands that it's probably not even 100 days. Anyway, so what I mean is that the Trump team needs to mature, and they're probably brilliant people with good ideas, and at least they are less willing to engage into kind of perpetual permanent wars around the globe and things like this, which is, I think, a positive thing. They understand that wars cost money and bring nothing, because these guys are very much money oriented, and therefore they understand that it will lead nowhere. On that part, I think this is I would welcome the Trump team and his new doctrine, if you want, because each president, U.S. president, has a specific doctrine, and that's probably the Trump doctrine to keep money, saving money instead of spending money on useless wars, to spend money more usefully in building or rebuilding the industrial fabrics of the United States. So that's a good idea. But to solve the problem, since they engage, I think they still need to do some homework to understand better the situation, to understand better what is at stake for both parties, not just one, and to get out of those schematic narrative that we had in the West, to trying to figure out the situations with very simplistic views, that you have the bad Hamas and the bad Russians and the good Ukrainians and the good Israelis and all that. And we see that all that is collapsing because this narrative is not in tune with reality. And therefore, there is a lot of work to be done by the Trump administration to get on the top of that.
When you hear Donald Trump together with Netanyahu, they're talking about if Hamas doesn't return the hostages by Saturday noon, the ceasefire between Hamas and Israel will be cancelled. How? What are they trying to do, in your opinion? And let's assume that all the hostages are getting back to their homes in Israel. What would happen to the hostages on the part of the prisoners and hostages on the part of Israelis, have they released all of the Palestinians?
Well,
Or
first
is
of
there
all,
any sort of plan in that direction?
so I have to adjust my camera because I think my camera is has a live on its own, uh, life on its own. Anyway, no. First of all, we have to understand that the ceasefire is not simply about exchange of prisoners. And that's very important to understand. There are other aspects to the ceasefire that nobody mentioned, and namely, a very important aspect, especially for the Palestinians, is the return of humanitarian aid. And in the ceasefire agreement, um, you have some elements to the humanitarian aid to have to be fulfilled by the Israelis. And I can show you uh, this document that was produced by the Palestinians. Okay, it's in Arabic, but we'll go here into it is a translation, automatic translation. So I'm not sure it's the best one, but in any case, it just shows, and without going into the details, that you should have had it was it was how to say that 12,000 trucks of aid should have come into Gaza, and you have a shortfall of 3,500, the same as the truck of fuel per day. You should have 50 trucks per day, but you have in fact a shortfall of 35 per day, and so on and so forth. The tents, for instance, 200,000 should have been delivered. Only 20,000, sorry, 200,000 should have been delivered. 20,000 have been delivered. So you have a shortfall of 180,000. So I think we have to understand that way, because we tend to see the problem just related to exchange of prisoners, but it's broader than this. And the reason why the Hamas decided to freeze the exchange of prisoners is because, on his part, Israel is not fulfilling its part of the contract. Again, we are back to exactly what we have said many times. Israel refuses to abide by the agreement they signed. And that's exactly what we have now. And now, of course, nobody talks about this. Nobody talks about this shortfall in this humanitarian aid. As a result, what we see in the media is that Hamas will freeze the exchange of prisoners. Therefore, it's their fault. You see? And that's where the media play a very, very bad role in the whole crisis, because they tend to ignore a part of the facts in order to portray the Palestinians as those who fail to abide by international law. They are terrorists after all, and all that, and and that creates a situation where, of course, if you see the situation like this, if you discard all the aspects that Israel is not fulfilling its part of the contract, then of course you say, oh, well, Hamas fails to do what he signed for, and therefore it is totally legitimate to to intervene with military force and things like this, to expel them and all that. You see, so we always know only one part of the reality, and that's extremely vicious in a certain sense, or perverse, because in fact we are giving a blank check for Israel to resume military operations against the Palestinians. So that's the first remark. The second remark is that Since October 2023, Israel claims that he wants to destroy Hamas and all that. And what we have seen so far is that Hamas has been reinvigorated by the situation. It has gained popular support across the world. Israel has lost the credibility it had around the world. So, what exactly the Americans want to achieve by resuming military operation or just sending the hell on in Gaza? I'm not exactly sure what is the objective of what Trump said and what Netanyahu said, by the way. So we are in a kind of situation. I mean, the Netanyahu has a culture of vengeance, and we have seen that, by the way they behave. For instance, when after the 7th of October, they started to revenge against other Palestinians, namely the West Bank or other places, or they started revenge against the Lebanese and all that. So it's a culture of revenge. It's a culture that extends beyond Israel, by the way. This is not just rhetoric. We have to take these threats very seriously. But at the same time, I think we need to make clear that the Hamas so far has always been extremely prudent with its actions, and has always complied with all the agreements that were signed with Israel in the past, even before the 7th of October. It's always the Israelis who broke the agreement. And by the way, I have read today that as of today, Israel has broken 257 times the ceasefire. The 257 breaches by Israel, killing people, killing children with snipers. Though that means it's not, it's targeted killing, and you kill children even during the ceasefire. So there is this idea of provocation by the Israelis, and probably I can even assume that the absence or the lack of humanitarian aid deliveries is part of a plan, because they know that the Palestinians will have to react to that. And therefore, they can use that as a pretext to resume operations. I mean, I wouldn't exclude that, because in the past, they have constantly do that. When we talk about Hamas, we talk about a terrorist group. And when you ask why, how can you define it as terrorist? And the answer is that Hamas shoots rockets on Israel, but nobody asks why do they shoot rockets. I tried to make this research, and I studied every single major launch of rockets that have been launched by Hamas and other Palestinian factions, because in fact the Palestinian Islamic Jihad was the first group to use missiles or rockets against Israel. In any case, I studied that, and I saw that in every single case, the rockets were launched after Israel broke a ceasefire by bombing people or civilians on the Gaza Strip. Invariably. And then when you look at the Israeli side of the thing, they say, well, when you bomb a place in Gaza to kill a Hamas leader, it's not considered as a breach of the ceasefire. And that they declared that unilaterally. So that's why for them it's normal to kill people, and when people react, it's terrorist act. But in fact, you don't find a single occasion in which the Palestinians have fired rockets against Israel without a reason and a prior breach or a breach of a ceasefire by Israel. It's systematic. But nobody says that. As a result, we have this picture of Hamas that randomly shoot at people, by the way, killing very few people. If you read my book on the Al-Aqsa flood, I show statistics of the people killed, and you see that the Palestinians, in fact, kill almost nobody in Israel with those rockets. They just want to react. They just want to show that they don't accept to be fired at without replying. So they reply. It's always a response. It's not a deliberate act of destruction. And that can be documented. So, and now I think we are exactly in a similar situation. The Israelis retain humanitarian aid they were supposed to deliver to Gaza in order to provoke the Palestinians to now. And then, of course, it's a very tricky game, because how would you react if you were Palestinians? If you identify the game of the Israelis, you would say, okay, we still continue to we exchange the prisoners and we do as if the situation were normal. But the problem is that the situation, and that will not encourage Israelis to fulfill their obligations, because they never did that before. So you're in a kind of a trap somehow. The advantage of the Hamas and Palestinians is that, in essence, they are stronger than the Israelis, and they have the public opinion support that they didn't have before. That's why it's very important to make the shortfalls that I have mentioned before, to make them known to the public, so that people understand that the Palestinians are not simply stopping the exchange of prisoners just for the sake of stopping. They stop because they have a reason for that. And the reason is that Israel is not fulfilling its part of the contract.
Colonel, when you look at Donald Trump and the way that he's trying to play with these leaders in the Middle East, do you think that he's going to be able that with this mindset of dividing these countries from each other or separating from each other in order to benefit Israel in a long run, is that going to work for the United States? Does he have any sort of leverage more than what the Biden administration had?
Well, that could have been the case, let's say 20, 15 years ago, probably, because all these countries are extremely dependent on the United States, or used to be dependent on the United States. But today, it's not exactly the same. We have a different geopolitical situation. And we see that, of course, with the whole issue of tariffs and all that. But we see that the world is more and more split in two parts. The West, and even the West starts to be very divided because of these tariffs and all that. But there's the West and the rest of the world. And all these countries, take Saudi Arabia, for instance, that wants to develop new technologies, new energy solutions, and all that, because they know that sooner or later they will not have oil anymore at one point, probably not very soon, but in any case, they have to prepare for that. Who is the leading power when it comes to new technologies and all that? China. You know, who is the power that tries or that has the ability or even the willingness sometimes to direct your own economy by preventing export or sanctioning and all that? US. So the tendency today, what you see across the South, the global South, as we can say it, is that they try to escape the dollar. They try to escape the United States, because the United States are in fact are a destabilizing factor in reality. And everybody tries to escape that, meaning that the leverage that the US has on these Middle East leaders is diminishing. Just let's talk about the Abraham Accords, or these normalization agreement with Israel and all that. In his first mandate, Donald Trump tried to bring Saudi Arabia and others to normalize their relationship with Israel. And they started to draft agreements. In these agreements, the so-called Abraham Accords or agreements, there was no mention of the Palestinian question. But today, Saudi Arabia has said clearly, if there is no Palestinian state, or if the question is not raised or put as a condition of the treaty, we will not normalize our relationship with Israel. And it's very clear. This is very clear. And if you see, for instance, the attempts from Trump to force Saudi Arabia to lower its the price of oil, so that that could make some pressure on Russia and all that, he received a flat no. Because today, all these countries, they know that they will have more to gain with the Eurasian bloc, let's say, and mainly China, but not only. But also the USSR with Russia, because Russia is also a provider of commodities and all that. So, meaning that they have an alternative. They don't need to have the United States. This idea that US should prevail all the time because they are simply the best, they have the best scientists, the best economists, the best money, the best whatever, this is a little bit a picture of the past. And everybody understands that the future belongs to Asia. And therefore, it's probably at this stage, it's a good idea to shift slowly towards the West. And we see that the West, first of all, the West, I mentioned before that the world is split between the West and the rest of the world. But it's not exactly true, because if you look at the West is split today. There is no common position about Palestine, about Ukraine, about NATO. Now you have the EU wanting to create its own small NATO somehow, because they don't trust NATO, because in NATO you have the US and they don't trust the US. And the US is put tariffs on all these friends. Canada is a NATO ally, and others, Germany and Japan and all that. Which, of course, Japan is not part of NATO, but The US is putting tariffs and punishing, in essence, their own allies. So, when you see that from far, you would say, well, the West is no longer the West. There is, within the West, there is a relationship between powers which is based on who is the more powerful. It's a power struggle within the Western bloc itself. So how can you trust these people? They have crumbling economies. They have crumbling political systems. All these countries, France, Germany, UK, Italy, even the US to some extent, have budgetary problems. They are not even able to manage their own countries, and they want to manage other countries. How can you trust such country? Meaning that it's not to say that US has no capability of leverage. US has still an influence. I mean, the dollar, even if we talk about de-dollarization and all that, the dollar remains so far the most used currency when it comes to trade, international trade, and all that. So that and that will stay that way for a while now. But the trend is changing direction, and everybody understands that. And the ability, for instance, of the West of supporting Ukraine, even supporting Israel, because at the end they provided bombs, okay, but they didn't provide any solution to solve the situation. They are not problem solvers. The West do not solve problems. They create problems. They generate problems. They have brought the Middle East into chaos in Iraq, in Syria, everywhere. They never came up with a solution. The West has, in the last 30 years or so, the West has not demonstrated any ability to be constructive. We have been destructive. We have destroyed everything, but we haven't built anything. And that's obvious with Ukraine. And Ukrainians themselves understand that. And it becomes almost like a joke to some extent, because Ukrainians start to realize that they have been framed by the Europeans and the US. That everything that was promised was in fact could not be kept. The US and the Europeans said they would help Ukraine as long as it takes. And now they say as long as we can. And we see that the West has no longer the military capabilities, the industrial capabilities, the financial capabilities, the budgetary capabilities to support Ukraine as they promised. So when you see that from the Middle East, what kind of picture do you have? You have a picture of countries that are bragging around that they are the best and all that, but beyond this, nothing concrete come out of this. No, when we talk about, again, I repeat myself, but when you talk about both Ukraine and Palestine, where are the Europeans? This fantastic European Union with all its values, its economic power and all that, where are they? They are totally absent from the diplomatic scene. They are totally absent from any solution, both in Ukraine and in Palestine. So what kind of credibility do you have? And that's the kind of problem. And you have more and more this, that's the reason why China has gained so much, let's say, credibility in Africa, because China has understood that if it wants to improve trade with Africa, let's say, that applies to other continents as well, but let's talk about Africa because that's a continent I know. And I lived in two countries that used to be, at that time, the most important presence of China on the African continent, namely Sudan and Kenya. But when the Chinese have understood that if they want to improve trade relations with Africa, they have first to develop the infrastructures. And therefore, the first step is to invest in infrastructure in Africa, to create and build railroads, roads, highways, ports, infrastructure to handle the containers and things like this. And then once you have that, then you have create a prerequisite to have a better trade relations, because all infrastructure are ready for that. And the West has never done that, at least not recently. They did that probably in the 19th century. I mean, France, probably Britain to some extent, in Asia a little bit, and so they tried to do so to create some infrastructures to create that in order to improve trade. But since Second World War, the West has not done that anymore. They have probably had to build a factory somewhere, but that's it. They didn't work to improve the road networks or railroads or communication networks and things like this. This is the reason why the Africans appreciate the Chinese, because everything goes step by step, but they move surely into a kind of a win-win situation. It's not just exploitation of a market as the Western powers did. It's also about creating the market first and then using the market to have trade. And that's, you see that with the Chinese. I mean, last year the Chinese have canceled 500,000 tons of wheat from the US, and instead they buy this in Brazil, in Africa, and somewhere else. So that means that the loss, again, it's a zero-sum game. What you lose on one side, it's a gain for somebody else, and that's exactly what happened with farm products with China. I mean, as soon as the Americans started to threaten with tariffs and all that, the Chinese said, "Okay, no problem. Do your tariff. We just stop trading with you, and we have other partners." China is the biggest consumer market in the world and the biggest producer as well. So they will find customers, and they will find also suppliers. So this is not a problem, and all that is a dry loss for the US, because their grain is more expensive than the one you could get in Brazil or somewhere else. As a result, we see this slow shift of let's say influence that goes in the direction of China and Asia at large. And therefore, when coming back to your question in the Middle East, I think Trump is a little bit too optimistic when he thinks that he has still a lot of leverage. They still have some leverage. It's not that they don't have any, but they might be. Now you have Iran and Saudi Arabia that basically have good relations. Iran has received the fighters from Russia. At the end of the day, probably fighters, I mean, those aircraft, coming from China or from Russia are probably more reliable, less expensive, and probably less subjected to political variation and decision that you have in Washington. And therefore, if you have a weapon like the F-35, for instance, uh, you'd better to be an ally of the US, because otherwise they can just prevent you to use your own aircraft. I remember when I was in NATO, I met a guy who was a test pilot for he was a Dutch test pilot of the F-35, and he told us, he said, well, if the US wants us to stop using the aircraft, they were just to turn a button and that's it. You cannot use them. So meaning that when you know that, and the same applies to Patriot missiles, THAAD systems, and all that. When you buy your weapons in the US, what is the guarantee you have that you can use these weapons in case of a conflict against Israel, for instance? And I'm not even talking about the quality of technology, which today, when it comes to armament, probably today is probably not in every respect, but in many respects, the balance of quality in terms of armaments is probably in favor of Russia, probably China as well. So this leverage is reducing at very high speed. And again, I don't know, and again, that doesn't mean that there is absolutely no leverage from that Trump can use. But I would say that people don't trust him. All the declaration he made about Gaza, that doesn't engage countries to consider Trump as a credible partner. That's my personal view.
Colonel, you mentioned a little bit about the situation with Ukraine. Zelensky is talking about he's trying to exchange the Kursk region for some region that he wants that right now is in the hand of Russians. How do you see the war in Ukraine right now and the way that Donald Trump is talking about minerals in Ukraine? They can pay us by rare earth minerals, and it's a lot of confusion. It doesn't seem that we're getting to the point that Donald Trump, as you mentioned, was talking about before 2024 presidential election, 24 hours, 100 days, but it doesn't seem that would come in the near future. How do you feel about it?
Well, I think it's exactly the same thing as what we have said for Palestine, that the Trump team, including Keith Kellogg, who is the special envoy for Ukraine, I think they had a very simplistic understanding of the situation in Ukraine. They didn't understand what is exactly at stake for both Russia and Ukraine. As a result, they came up with a very simplistic view on what can be done and what can be achieved with this idea of freezing. Of course, if you depart from the idea that Russia is suffering from the conflict more than Ukraine, then you would say they will welcome if we have a freeze of the situation on the front line. But the problem is that it's exactly not what the situation is. The fact of the matter is that Russia is in a position of force in Ukraine, doesn't need to have a pause in the conflict. On the contrary, they would prefer to use the current dynamics that you have on a battlefield, and therefore the idea of freezing the conflict, besides the fact that it's something that the Russians have discarded right away because they have said, well, we don't want to come back in the same situation as the Minsk agreement, in which people decided to go into this agreement for the simple reason that they wanted to rearm and prepare their forces for further action. So, in fact, it was a pause just in order to rearm. It was not in good faith. Therefore, the Russians have said, well, we were fooled once, but we will not get fooled twice. And therefore, there is no way that we will accept a freezing of the situation. They don't need that. They are moving ahead. Therefore, there is no need for them to have a pause. And that's it. So that shows that the Trump team came into in office 2 weeks ago with a very simplified understanding of the situation, and now they are discovering that the situation is a bit more complex. And the situation has been even more complex because precisely all the tariffs and all that have triggered response from China. And China has banned the export of some very rare minerals, like the gallium, germanium, there are some others, and even tungsten, I think, has also a ban or restriction on delivering. And if you look at who has the most reserves and the most production of tungsten and germanium and things like this, it's China. And US is depending on China for its supply of critical minerals that are used to produce semiconductors, which are considered as critical for the US. Meaning that US has understood that by using tariffs and having response from the China in particular, that I'm not sure they even expected that. That's very strange. They thought they would apply tariffs and sanctions without any response. And I think that's exactly the same problem with Palestine. That I think Trump is overestimating the power of the US and the position of the US in the world. In any case, what happened is that the US has now a problem with its supply chain when it comes to semiconductor and critical minerals. And that's the reason why Zelensky picked up the problem and said, well, because the whole issue in Ukraine, as we have mentioned on the channel a couple of times, I mean, again, Trump is not a pacifist, but he has understood that funding a war doesn't. I have to correct this my camera because I'm not sure. Here it's a little bit better. I lost my path.
Yeah, you were mentioning that Trump is not the pacifist, and he's
yes, he's not a pacifist, but he understood that the war in Ukraine is just a black hole, and therefore you pour money into that and you have nothing in return. And for Zelensky, he said, well, that's probably the reason why he doesn't want to provide additional weapons. And therefore, we need to create an incentive for Trump to provide support, both financial and military support. And this incentive was, we'll exchange your support against minerals, access to minerals. But there are two problems. The first is that, again, I don't know what, and again, it's a little bit like Gaza, because Trump changed his mind very quickly. Again, it's a hip shooter. So initially, my understanding, and I think the understanding of Zelensky, is that you are not willing to provide additional support. Well, we give you an incentive, you provide additional support, and we give you access to rare earth and minerals. And that's probably how initially Trump understood it. But again, Trump doesn't want to get involved in this conflict anymore. And now the narrative of Trump has changed. He said, well, we agree to have the minerals, but not to provide additional support, but to compensate what we have already paid. so, so that's, I think Zelensky, to some extent, has been framed by Trump with that. By giving this proposal, he gave Trump an opportunity to say, oh, okay, I take the minerals, but not for additional thing, but to pay what we have already delivered, which is a radical change. That's the first point. A second point is that when Zelensky said we give access to rare earth and things like this, well, it has to take into account about who owns these minerals. Because in fact, the ground where those minerals are belong to individuals. It's not just land that belongs to God. It belongs to some oligarchs, in particular the oligarchs that is owning Burisma. Burisma is the company in which the son of Joe Biden used to be part of the staff, meaning that these earths, they belong to someone. So first, before giving access to Trump, you have first to sort out whether you can even access this, legally, by talking to the real owner of that, which is probably you can solve this issue. But there's another issue that you cannot really solve. I don't know if I have a map here, probably that will explain oh yes, that's the situation. And here I can show you this map. That's where you have those critical minerals in Ukraine. And you can see that the bulk of these minerals are in the east of the country. And basically you have the oblast of Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, Kherson here, and Dnipropetrovsk here. So you see that the bulk of that is basically, I would say, under sovereignty or power or influence of the Russians. And if we look at what's happening on the battlefront today and the rapid advance of the Russian forces in the east of the country, basically you would say that most of these resources could be, in a few weeks or a few months, they could be under the full control of the Russians. So what can you give to Trump? So we are in this kind of situation in which, and that's something which is key to understand, I think, the way both Ukrainians and Russians conduct the conflict. For the Ukrainians, Zelensky in particular, the narrative is the key aspect of the conflict. The way it has, everything is in the way he sells the conflict to the West. And we have here a real example of this, the gap you have between the narrative and the reality. And that's where you can ask yourself how realistic and how sane or insane are the leaders, both in Ukraine and in the West at large, because it's very fine to say, and everybody talks about this kind of exchange minerals against support or things like this. But does Ukraine have full control over these minerals? And if yes, for how long? And therefore, this is the whole aspect of this conflict on the Western side. We tend to understand the conflict based on a narrative instead of trying to understanding based on the reality of on the ground. And that's exactly what the Trump team is discovering at this stage. And they are discovering a situation which is very far away from what you can extract from the media and all that. And the fact of the matter is that if you come to the point that you will have to negotiate with the Russians, you have to negotiate based on the reality, not based on a fantasy. And that's exactly where you see the real obstacle to a solution. And although I expected the Trump administration to come up with feasible solutions, probably not in 24 hours, but let's say until the end of the year, for instance. But now I tend to be more pessimistic on that aspect, and I feel that the Keith Kellogg and others are not prepared to understand to bring up solutions that can be acceptable for the Russians. And there is no way you can bypass the acceptance of the Russians, because they are winning on the ground. They are winning on the ground. And there are some aspects that you cannot, when you talk about the return of those oblasts. I mean, today it's no longer so much a team, but anyway, the idea that you could return those territory to Ukraine in 20 years or something like that, this is a fantasy. The reason why Vladimir Putin wants to keep the 4 regions, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk, is precisely because of the objective he set at the beginning of the offensive, to protect the population. Because we know that if, let's say, the Russians would withdraw from these republics, you would have revenge action on the local population, on all those who somehow lived with the Russians or accepted the Russians or even cooperated with the Russians. And you will have, as you had in 2014 or between 2014 and 2022, where you had a very massive revenge actions, and in Mariupol they found huge mass grave of people who had been killed in 2014, for instance, and you would return to such a situation where the Ukrainians would revenge. So there is no way the Russians want that, and for that reason you can just forget the idea that these 4 regions would be returned to Ukraine at one point. Probably there might be discussions on other territories, but on those ones you will not have any discussion, because the objective of the operation, the military operation, was to protect the Russian population in Ukraine. And therefore, the only possibility today is to keep them under the full protection of Russia. And therefore, so that's the reality on the ground. The fact that nobody wanted to acknowledge that the minority, the Russian minority, was mistreated since 2014, the fact that the West didn't want to acknowledge that has in fact created a situation where Russia was obliged to intervene. So again, by refusing the reality, by refusing to accept simple real facts on the ground and replacing them by a narrative, we just created a situation that today is in disadvantage for Ukraine. And that will continue that way because the West has not understood that. And therefore, we continue to live on a narrative rather than on the reality of the ground.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Colonel, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Pleasure.